Thanks so much, Heather. It's really nice to be with you all today. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Tara Houska and Sherri Mitchell, who are going to be in this conversation, sharing their work with us. Tara is an environmental and Indigenous rights activist, lawyer, and the founder of GNU Collective. And Sherri Mitchell is also an attorney, a teacher, activist, and author of one of my favorite books, Sacred Instructions. Hi to both of you. It's really nice to see you.
Hello, Katharine.
Hey, Bijou.
Hi. I think I will just open us with the words that open all we can save, because it feels like a nice grounding for this conversation. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And I also want to start this conversation, Tara, by grounding in where you are and the work that you have been doing on the front lines of land and water defense, working to stop Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. And for those who may not be familiar, could we just start with sharing a little bit about what's at stake and where things stand from where you are?
Yeah, sure. Bijou Ginawa, Jabawekwe, Indigenous Makwa, Didem, Coaching, and Dunchpa. My name is Tara Houska. I'm Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation. I'm Anishinaabe calling in from Anishinaabe territory. I'm actually indoors to make this call to speak with all of you. Normally, I spend my days and nights in an outdoor resistance camp, pipeline resistance camp, where we've been living and building and growing and working and all the things for the past 3 years here in our territory, trying to defend our wild rice beds from 1 million barrels of tar sands a day in the form of a new pipeline coming out of Alberta. The day-to-day is we're at almost 100 arrests, probably over that now, based on what's happened over the last week, in the last month. And we're looking towards the new administration, the new Biden administration, to try to suspend the Army Corps of Engineers permitting for many of the same reasons that many of these projects are challenged by tribal nations, including the Dakota Access Pipeline, which just had a win last week. But the pipeline's already in the ground, and we're trying to stop that before it happens. So we're literally putting our bodies on the line in front of these machines on almost a daily basis at this point, out in the cold. So that's where I'm at.
You mentioned now around 100 arrests a day. Could you talk to us a little bit about kind of the legal realities of folks who are standing up and putting their bodies on the line?
Yeah, so it's actually about 100 arrests so far in the last month. We have to be COVID safe, just like everyone else in this pandemic, which has made creativity and very careful social distancing a priority. We're trying to do as much as we can with as few people as we can, recognizing that we are in this pandemic, while at the same time knowing that all over northern Minnesota in these rural areas, there are man camps and over 2,000 out-of-state workers that have come in. There are COVID hotspots all over our counties. There is increased violence, increased threats of violence. I've personally experienced some of this, some of the surveillance and harassment that happens. I actually have to go in this week because they cracked my windshield at one of the last demonstrations. And that's what happens when we are out defending our land and our territory as the colonization continues. This is just an extension of the cultural genocide and colonization that's happened since this country began, and an extension of what oligarchy and extreme capitalism look like, including environmental capitalism, I'd like to add. I know green biz, and wanted to maybe touch on that a bit.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, Tara, in the context of what you wrote about for All We Can Save. And I want to bring Sherri in, because among the many hats you wear, Sherri, one of them is that you're a teacher. And one of the things that I've heard you teach so poignantly about is commodification, and this the permeation of this commodifying worldview. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, and maybe more importantly, how we begin to root it out?
Yeah, Kwe, andali wisi wana hamu kwasita na jioba na wabskewi, pasilda andil na bama kawasus nilba na wabskewi, nagakakagos niltibayek. Tara, Nitabesk, it's good to see your face. And we're all, continuing to support you and doing what we can to stand with you there in this critical stand that's so vitally important, not only to Mother Earth, but for cultural continuity. And I just want to add one thing to what Tara is saying. It's important to recognize that these are not accidental placements within Indigenous territories. These are purposeful, well-planned, systematic attacks on tribal land and water rights, attacks on tribal sovereignty because Indigenous rights have been an obstacle to industry. And so these attacks have been well strategized. They could have been placed anywhere. They're being placed in Indigenous territories for the specific purpose of tearing down Indigenous rights. And I think that needs to be recognized. And so when we're talking about commodification, one of the things that I think is most challenging for people within the mainstream society is that they've been raised to think of themselves as one of two things, a commodity or as a capitalist. And my dog has strong opinions about this, apparently. And so when we look at, we heard Bill Gates saying that we need to look at new ways to create and consume. We need to do a heck of a lot more than change the ways that we create and consume. We need to actually change our relationship with consumption. We have to reevaluate our entire value structure so that consumption is not holding a primary role within the value structure that we're operating under. And so when your entire value system for your society is based on notions of commerce and consumption, how do you get away from that? We commodify ourselves in nearly every aspect of our lives. And I just saw the 10-minute mark, and I want to make sure we have enough time to go into other areas. So, we really need to stop thinking about ourselves in those terms. We need to start really looking at changing the ways that we apply value. And we need to recognize that destruction of the earth has become a pay-to-play endeavor, that there are laws put in place, there are policies put in place, penalties put in place that essentially mean that anyone who has the money to violate the law can go ahead and violate the law. And, they'll just get a fine and they add that into their cost of doing business. And so until people can really change their hearts and minds, there needs to be a change in the ways that we're addressing those businesses who are violating those laws, and have catastrophic costs for those who are damaging Mother Earth, who are destroying people's ways of life, who are purposely violating the human rights of peoples across the globe. And I think that, we need to look at the cost of doing business in terms of sustainability, not just bottom line. And until those things can change and we can stop looking at ourselves as either a commodity or a capitalist and can begin to look at one another as human beings, and as being sacred, part of what's sacred, all life being sacred, then we're going to have to be able to enact some type of measures that are going to stop the onslaught against life.
Yeah. And this is a thread that really runs through your essay, Tara, on sacred resistance from the collection. There are a couple of sentences I just wanted to call out to frame this question. You write, much of the space we call the climate movement appears to be modeled after the same systems of inequity and separation we are attempting to change, undo, or outright dismantle. And you go on towards the end. I do not believe we will solar panel or vote our way out of this crisis without also radically reframing our connection with our mother. And you call for a really fundamental value shift in the movement. And I was hoping you might be willing to expand on that shift and why it's so deeply necessary.
Yeah, sure. And I just have to say, I always appreciate being in spaces with Sherri because she just lays it down so directly. Yeah, I mean, I think everything that we are taught in the colonial structure that we all exist within in this particular society is structure. We are taught to separate ourselves. We are taught to create titles and separations and differences between ourselves, whether that's class, whether that's gender, whether that's like whatever position in life that we find ourselves in this society. It also means that things are based on utility, right? Like we're still living in a very utilitarian mindset all the time. And that extends to quote unquote movement, in which, you know, you have situations where you're supposed to produce metrics of success and say, you know, things like victory over and over and over again, when that's actually really not the case most of the time. It's like the little micro bars that we set for ourselves. To me, like the type of victory that I've seen through living and working and building a community of resistance is creating leaders who actually hold the earth in their hearts, who understand how hard it is to actually be in relationship with nature and to do the work that it takes to live in balance. It is not easy to live in balance. It does require some discomfort. It requires sacrifice. It requires recognizing that there are parts of our lives that we need to unplug and radically reform. I mean, we're not going to, solar panels and batteries and all those things still require extraction from other communities. And so you're still at some level saying your community is worth less than ours. You know, your community is okay. It's okay to sacrifice you in the overall, you know, shift to transition. No, we're talking about just transition. To me, there's a lot to be said about upcycling, but there's also a lot to be said, as Sherri said, about our consumption and what that means in terms of our overall impact. I mean, I know that I actually spend a lot of my time fighting fossil fuel infrastructure and fighting giant, you know, corporations who are directly contributing to the overall climate crisis that we're in and the entrenched fossil fuel industry that we are in. However, I would also say that we do bear personal responsibility for ourselves and our own choices that we make in our lives. There is a lot to be done on that front, and not just to point outward instead of looking inward into our own relationships and our own connectivity.
Yeah. And Sherri, you are also in the midst of birthing a new center for learning and community, and sort of modeling that living in balance with one another, with place. And you've shared that it will be a matriarchal space, and you've used the term climate matriarchy. Would you speak to what that means and why a matriarchal perspective is so needed in this time of transformation?
Absolutely. And thank you, Katharine, for holding this space for us and for all you do. I think that, you know, we have to recognize that those who have framed the societies that we live in have not been the givers of life. And so those who are actually the ones responsible for creating life, the mothers, for nurturing and cultivating that life, the aunties and the grandmas and all of those who are the most stringent protectors of life have been removed from the discussion. And this is something that we have talked at great length about, how the voices of authentic mothering, matriarchal, matrifocal vision has been eliminated from the discussion because we are not being allowed to speak on behalf of life. And because we've been denied the ability to speak on behalf of life, the societies that have been created to destroy life. And so we see this energy moving through that is really built on destruction. And so unless we get the mothers who love all of their children and the grandmothers back into that center of our societies where they belong, then we're going to continue to see a world spiraling out of balance. And so how do you restore balance in a healthy way within a family? You oftentimes go to the mothers and the grandmothers because they're the ones who pull everyone together. And without that pulling together energy and wisdom, really, there's a great wisdom to that, then we don't have any hope of being able to solve the problems that have been created largely by men over the last 500 years.
I wish we had many more minutes than we do for this conversation, but the subtitle of the session is Why We Must Learn from Indigenous Wisdom, and there's no learning without deep listening. So as we just wrap up our time together, what is it that you want this audience to hear before we close the session, and what is it you want them to do with what they have gleaned?
So, I mean, for me, the thing that I hope that people really start thinking about is mechanisms for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and to look at the ways that climate change adaptation and mitigation is often geared toward entry into the market economy, as opposed to moving it toward ways of life that are in alignment with the sustaining of life. And so, that's what I hope people will really start to think about, the ways that they're actually perpetuating the problem through the solutions that are being presented.
I really hope that people that are listening to this and that are taking the time to listen to Indigenous folks and Indigenous voices, and thank you again, also Katharine, from me for holding this space, is that Native people are 5% of the world's population. We hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. 5% of the population globally holding 80% of the biodiversity. I think we know something and we have some information to share. And so putting our voices into some romanticized, this is just like hopes and dreams and here's reality and this is how economy really works. We've been around for thousands and thousands of years. We've learned something in our time here on this planet that we all share. And obviously those connections and that deep interconnectedness with nature is something that means that we have 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So please listen and please do your best to take our words to heart instead of just putting them into some, oh, that was inspiring and it made me feel good, but back to business. This should be the business. The business of life is critically important to life. We care about life and we want life givers and life to continue on this earth because we owe it to the next generation to come.
And I just want to add that it's important to shift Indigenous rights away from being aspirational and start making them applicable.
Thank you both so much for taking this time, for sharing, especially Tara, stepping off the front lines and indoors to be with us today. Please, folks, follow the work that's happening to stop Line 3, support in the ways that you can. And if you want to kind of continue this learning journey, please do pick up Sherri's book, Sacred Instructions. That is a really nourishing and illuminating read. And I will hand it back over to you, Heather. Thank you so much.